Well, ladies and gentlemen, I shall begin by thanking John and Melissa for inviting me here, and by saying what a great honour and pleasure it is to follow Tony Abbott. A great deal of which he has said will have some bearing on what I say. Now, the title of my lecture I was given was How We Got Here, which rather made me feel like the man in the Monty Python sketch who was asked to summarise La Recherche de Pompidou in 30 seconds. But I assure you I won't be breaking into song. I'd like to talk primarily about the Anglosphere and about culture, and about this alliance that perhaps has gone unregarded over the past 30 or 40 years because of the rise of China and because still of the dominance of the United States. But I think it is an extremely important global grouping. If you talk about the Anglosphere, you may not know what I mean. It is the United States, it is the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Some would bring India into this, but for the purposes of this talk, I shall leave them out. It was Tommy Lascelles, Sir Alan Lascelles, the private secretary to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth II, who said, Anglo-American relations will be all right so long as nobody tries to improve them. And I think that this was for many years the dominant theme of the Anglo-American relationship, that we rubbed along well, that we had an understanding between us based on the common law, based on language, based on religion, of course. We, the Protestant and Reformed, and they with their various ideas of Protestantism, Catholic thought being a minority at this point. But I think that that idea that we should leave alone and let it develop organically has led to, over the past 40 years particularly, but very specifically over the past 25 years, a real misunderstanding between America and Britain. Some of which, on the right, I fear has come to be deeply reactionary and misplaced. It was our own John O'Sullivan who said on Firing Line in 1990 that America and Britain are a single cultural community. That idea has warped and waned, and I think the great wane began with Suez, the Suez Crisis of 1956, when it was conceived by a great many on the British right that America was trying, through force and diplomacy, to take what was left of the British Empire for itself. This was, of course, true. There can be no denying it. But the point remained that it was, in fact, in our interest that America should have done this, that America should have taken up the mantle of empire. And if you look at those countries that America has intervened in over the past 70 years, those countries where America has put in a great deal of aid effort, those countries where America has strong diplomatic ties, they are, to a great degree, the former colonies of the British Empire. Harold Macmillan recognized this very clearly. He had a great affection for America, which was strengthened by a familial connection with John F. Kennedy. It was Macmillan who said that we should be to the Americans as the Greeks were to the Romans, a sort of civilizing elder brother or avuncular figure. Lady Thatcher, of course, recognized this most strongly, and her collaboration with Ronald Reagan, her deep affection for America, but also her recognition that by maintaining the structure of the Anglo-American agreement, they could defeat communism, was, I think, one of the most important and also most difficult decisions taken by a British premier in the post-war period, because don't underestimate the degree to which the British right and aspects of the British left were and remain deeply anti-American. The problem, I think, for many on the right now came under Tony Blair, and what they would conceive as being a supine adherence to whoever happened to be the American president of the day decided should be policy. All the grit and determination that characterized Mrs. Thatcher's relationship with Ronald Reagan, you only have to think of the invasion of Grenada and indeed the Falkland Islands, where Mrs. Thatcher had to stiffen the sinews of the State Department and of Reagan himself. All of that resolution seemed to have been lost under Mr. Blair and his successors. I cannot think of a single instance worth mentioning to you today of a post-Blair British Prime Minister standing up for British interests against American. And this passes into culture, or rather is an adjunct. Culture is an adjunct to this. And it's what I have termed the Friendsification of British culture. Now, you may all remember the American sitcom Friends, broadcast between 1994 and 2004. I think it's a perfect example of how, through cable television, through wider global communication, and through a loss of cultural confidence in the other parts of the Anglosphere, we came to assume American ideas, and even American ideas of language. One instance of this being this appalling trend nowadays to turn nouns into verbs and verbs into nouns, so that Melissa might have been said to gift me an invite, which to an Englishman is a real wrench to say, I have to tell you. And this has really bred resentment on the right, because there has always been suspicion of European culture among the British, but particularly on the conservative side of things, while recognizing that it is a culture worth admiring, studying, and to some degree emulating. You only have to think of the composers of the late 19th and early 20th century, who were very clearly influenced by Brahms, and in the case of Vaughan Williams, studied with Ravel, to see that there was an appreciation, while at a distance, and an idea that we should have a culture of our own. What I think many on the British right see now is that our culture has, over the past 25 years, given up. That everything that we do now, our television, our radio, our novels, our film, is a sort of thin imitation of American culture. That our language and thought has become a thin imitation of American language and thought. And I think this needs to be borne in mind when we are going to talk about the Anglosphere as being a potential part of the great power structure of the next, say, 25 years. That this resentment simmers. Unless it is addressed, it will not allow the Anglosphere to flourish. And one of the simmering resentments was characterized by the rather ill-advised comments of President Obama at the time of Brexit, or the time of the Brexit referendum. It is perfectly reasonable for an American president to offer a view on a referendum made by one of its closest and greatest partners about their trading relationships. What I think it was not permissible to do, and where I think the criticism was just, was that President Obama's comments went well beyond what would normally be expected. Just as President Biden's criticisms of Liz Truss's economic policies went far beyond what would normally be expected. There is this idea now that the Americans can talk to the British and not take our feelings, our history, and our intellectual hinterland into regard. The opinion pages of the New York Times are the perfect demonstration of this, and if you have half an hour to spare and want to be amused, I suggest you go and look at some of the wilder things that they have written about Britain since 2016. I want to turn now to America. I've talked a great deal about Britain in the first 5 minutes of this talk. I want to turn now to America and to think about how we have got to where we are with America. The first thing to recognize is that American institutions have by and large been compromised, entirely compromised by the Gramscian left and by its ideas. The 68 I think, they are one of the most effective political movements of the post-war period. To give you an instance of this, there was a study done of Harvard academics this year. 82% of those academics said that they were on the liberal or the very liberal side of the political spectrum. 1% said that they were on the conservative side of the spectrum. Think of the impact, ladies and gentlemen, that this has. Think of the deeply, deeply corrosive impact this has on the freedom of thought in American universities. Now, that same trend carries on in British universities, Australian universities, Canadian and New Zealand universities. The institutional collapse of America, the way that the conservative right simply did not see this danger for what it was, this well-planned campaign for how deep it went, is, I should submit to you, one of the real failures of America in the past half-century. Because these were not hidden aims. Anybody who cared to do so could look up the works of Gramsci, look at the works of the Frankfurt School, and see precisely what the aims would be once they got a toehold in these institutions. And yet nothing was done. Why is this? Well, it's, I suppose, to a degree what Karl Popper called the paradox of tolerance, that we think that we should give our intellectual opponents the breadth and space to express their opinions, and indeed, sometimes, the ability to practice them, just so that the rest of us, or the rest of the world that's less politically involved, can see how poor they are. The left will never, and has never, given us that opportunity ourselves. In every instance that you can think of, the left will close down debate on the right, delegitimize the right's ability to speak in public. Cancel culture is a direct consequence of this policy. And we knew it was going to happen, and we did nothing. To turn back for a moment to the Blair cabinet, to Britain and therefore to the first two cabinets of Tony Blair, the journalist and writer Peter Hitchens, brother of Christopher Hitchens, has pointed out again and again and again just how deep the communist infiltration of the Labour Party as a student movement had been in the 1960s and 70s, and how many of the people in Blair's cabinets came through that movement. and had, you can just mention Peter Mandelson as one of the guiding lights of New Labour. To think that they would have changed their minds so drastically is, I think, a foolish thing. And to think, therefore, that their policies in government would have been any different from their inclinations as students, however more they were subtilized and however more they were sharpened, is foolish. I think the same has happened on the American left. You don't need me to tell you this, but it is worth pointing out. And it's worth pointing out that this goes through the charity sector, this goes through the quangocracy, it goes through aid agencies. It is both operational domestically and internationally. And it is deeply corrosive of the post-war settlement of the Anglosphere. Because how can we possibly have an institution based on language, common law, and religion when all of these things are held to be contemptible? And how can we maintain, strengthen, and expand? I would want to see this expanded to India. How can we maintain, strengthen, and expand an alliance based on these things when every factor and facet and force of the left is doing what it can to prevent this? And this is what I call the active left versus the complacent right, which I think has been a trend, and I think is only now, over the past 5 years, since President Trump and since Brexit, beginning to change. It is, of course, in Hungary and Poland and Slovakia and the Czech Republic that the Visegrad Four further advanced, and I think there are some aspects of the difference between European conservatism and British and American conservatism that explain this, because it is more culturally attuned, and because our conservatism is more aligned to property than anything else. But I think it's a lesson that we could learn from Central Europe, that the right must be constantly vigilant. We cannot take it as read that simply because our ideas are powerful in and of themselves, they will be listened to, particularly not when in institutions and in the media, these views are suppressed. I'm going to move on now to COVID. Why? Because I think it demonstrates how deeply our resistance has been corroded by the expansion of leftist ideas, by the idea of the state as an infallible protector, and by the dominance of these trains of thought within the media. When the Wuhan virus, as Mr. Abbott quite rightly called it, began to be noticed in the West, there was no suggestion that for 2 years societies would be locked down, people prevented from leaving their homes and transacting business, forced to wear facial coverings while in public transport, shops and restaurants. There was no suggestion that we would follow a Chinese model. That we can see. And yet, as Neil Ferguson has said, not the historian who's speaking later, but the epidemiologist from London, once we saw that Italy and China got away with it, Italy followed, and we knew we could too. These totalitarian instincts are deeply written in the DNA of these people. And yet, what was there from the Conservative Party here, in Britain, from the Republican Party in America, in terms of real concern and immediate fight back? Nothing. Nothing at all. Those public intellectuals, those epidemiologists, those people who spoke out, Lord Sumption, the Supreme Court Justice, Karol Sikora, the great oncologist, who said, this will cause havoc in cancer, in heart disease, in stroke. These people were not only ignored, they were told that they were going to cause deaths. Carl Heneghan, the epidemiologist at the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, had the same experience, despite having sat on one of the committees that advised on this. I myself wrote a piece in the Daily Telegraph of London in May of 2020, in which I suggested that we might step back. We might think about whether these policies were in fact the right way, morally the right way, culturally the right way to go about dealing with this not terribly destructive virus. I cannot tell you the number of comments I had along the lines of, I hope that you or someone you love dies of this. And Jonathan Sumption has told me he had exactly the same thing. And yet we were castigated not only by those on the left who would seek to impose greater state control, we were castigated by our own people. And we were told that what we were doing was irresponsible, immoral, libertarian, which has become now, in Britain at least, and I think in parts of America, one of the greatest slurs you could throw at anyone. We were told that we were putting liberty ahead of safety. Because this is not simply about disease. This is about the expansion of the state under the guise of looking after you. This is now what the Gramscian project has resulted in, is the expansion of the state to such a degree that most people simply have no idea of the danger of it and of the breadth of it. I'll give you a small example that cashless payment is now pretty much taken as read in large parts of the UK. Has anybody thought about the impact of this, not only on the poor who are unbanked and therefore unable to access basic services, but on our ability to be private individuals and transact business as we see fit without the state looking at this. And I know that the idea of a Chinese social credit system is somewhat overdone, but I think that this is one of those instances where you can see it being pushed forward. And to return to the other parts of the Anglosphere, where there is, I'm afraid, a tendency going back farther than in Britain and America for what C.S. Lewis called omnipotent moral busybodies. Again, as Clive James said, Australia, the problem with Australia is not that it is a nation of former convicts, it's a nation of prison warders. There is this idea in New Zealand, Australia, and to some degree Canada, that you should and must protect overwhelmingly. They've not become prison states, but they've become hospital states where you are not considered competent to judge whether or not you are at risk, and you are indeed judged to be a risk to all those around you. And one aspect of this that goes even further, and I think should be a topic for thought and discussion on the right, is the advance of euthanasia laws in Canada under the Medical Assistance in Dying scheme. A truly abhorrent piece of legislation, which is, I should say, an utter moral failure. And those in the Anglosphere who fail to condemn this are failing to look at what is going to happen next in their own countries. And I will just leave that thought there. So this loss of cultural confidence in the Anglosphere is, I think, one of the truly devastating aspects of geopolitics over the past 50 years. It was G.K. Chesterton who said that when men choose not to believe in God, they do not hereafter believe in nothing. They then become capable of believing in anything. And when all those institutions that teach you how to think and suggest what you might believe have been pushing down a certain path for 50 years, it is no surprise, therefore, that the greater majority of people should not only be inured against leftist thought, but should think that it is normal thought. And to finish, I must, of course, discuss Donald Trump. It would be remiss not to mention him. And I think he is a phenomenon who can directly be described, as Chesterton describes, of men capable of believing in anything when the belief goes. Not in this case in God, but in the power of the Republican Party at its moderate to right wing to win elections and to speak for America. Once that power is lost, because I think of the supine nature of the Republican Party in the face of Obama, you open the way for Trump. And I would leave you with this final thought, that Trump can be defined and explained precisely by the cult of personality. He is a direct analogy in that regard to Joseph Stalin. His triumphs are enumerated and enlarged by him and by his supporters to such a degree that they would appear to be the work of God, whereas his failures are reduced and pushed to one side. There is this idea that whatever Trump does, I should say, this idea maintains among the Republican right who want to see him as president again, but also I think among a great many normal Americans, there is this idea that only Trump can stand up. There is this idea that only he can beat the left. Ladies and gentlemen, to have reached the position where Donald Trump is the hope of the American right, the only intellectual savior of conservatism, is, I should submit, one of the greater failures of the Anglosphere over the past 50 years. And I hope that some of what I've said today will allow people watching this at home and you in the room to do something to make sure that he does not remain that for very long. Thank you.